Hi guys, my name is Sanjay Gupta. I'm a consultant cardiologist in York. You may recall that 2 or 3 days ago I put a video out on making sense of your echo report, in which I talked about the heart and what the echo shows. But because that was quite an information heavy video and went on for a while, I stopped at the left heart and I said I was going to do another video on the right heart so that you can understand what the right heart does and what the echo shows. Okay. So the first thing to understand is this is the right heart here, okay? This is the right atrium here. This is the tricuspid valve here. This is the right ventricle, all right? The first thing to understand is that the right ventricle looks much smaller than the left ventricle. The second thing to understand is that the right ventricle is much thinner than the left ventricle, because the right ventricle doesn't do as much work as the left ventricle does. And I'll explain that to you. Now, what is the function of the right heart? Well, blood from the rest of the body, so from your legs, from your kidneys, from your liver, after the blood gets there, these organs take the oxygen out of the blood to use. And oxygen depleted blood comes back from the rest of the body up this vessel here, through which it enters the right atrium. All right, from the right atrium it goes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and the right ventricle will then pump it out across this valve called the pulmonary valve to the lungs. So the aim of the right heart is to take oxygen depleted blood and pump it to the lungs, where it can collect oxygen and then go into the left heart. Okay, now if you have a problem with your lungs, then it tends to affect the right heart, because it is the right heart that is trying to pump blood into the lungs. Okay, so if you have a problem with your lungs, then it becomes more difficult for the right heart to get blood into the lungs. And as a consequence, the right heart will be put under strain. Let's say what happens if, for example, you've got bad lungs, if you've got COPD, emphysema, all right? This is the blood vessel through which your right heart is going to pump blood into the lungs. But because the lungs are bad, you can't get that blood out. So the blood cannot get out, which means it stays here. All right, it stays in the right ventricle, which then results in the right ventricle stretching. All right, because the blood can't get pumped out, so the right ventricle starts stretching. And because the blood hasn't gone into the lungs, not as much blood has gone into the lungs because it's been difficult to get the blood into the lungs, left's blood goes from the lungs to the left heart. So, and from the left heart, less blood goes to the vital organs. And as a consequence, what happens is the vital organs, like the kidneys, will sense that there's less blood, and they will absorb more water from the urine to try and restore the amount of blood you have in the body. And then you have more blood coming back, but actually you still have the same problem. The right heart is still going to have difficulty getting that blood through the bad lungs, and therefore you get into this horrible state where less blood is going out, the kidneys absorb more. Because they're absorbing more, the right ventricle starts stretching, and because the right ventricle stretches, eventually it starts losing its elasticity and it starts getting bigger and weaker. And what then happens is, because the blood can't go out, blood can't come in, and that blood that would normally come in from the rest of the body, like our legs, can't get in there. So because it can't get in there, what it tends to do is it tends to leak out. And this is what causes leg swelling in some people who have right heart problems. So one of the common manifestations of right heart problems is leg swelling, all right, or bloating around the stomach, because fluid starts accumulating around the stomach as well, particularly when you're lying down. When you look at your echocardiogram, and if you see a problem with the right heart, there are two things that should go through your mind. Number one, is there a problem with the lungs? Because the lungs are against what are where the right heart is trying to pump the blood. So if there's a problem with the lungs, it'll be reflected in the right heart. The second thing to understand is that sometimes if there's no problem with the lungs, another way by which the right heart can get affected is if there is a hole in the heart. If there is a significant hole in the heart, what will happen is that blood will go into the right heart from the left heart, because the left heart has a higher pressure system, because the left heart has to pump blood all around the body. So the pressure in the left heart is higher, and therefore if there's a hole in the heart, the left heart will actually pump blood into the right heart, particularly across the atrial septum. And then what happens is all this extra blood comes into the right heart starts stretching, and as it stretches, it gets bigger and weaker. So there's two things I think of whenever I see a right heart problem. Number one, I think, is there a problem with the lungs? Number two, I want to make sure in my mind that there is not a hole in the heart, particularly something called an atrial septal defect. When you look at your echo report will firstly comment on the size of the right atrium. Okay, they don't normally give you a value. They'll just say, is it normal size or is it big? If it is big, it's big because of two reasons. One, either there's a problem with the right ventricle, i.e. the right ventricle can't get the blood into the lungs, the right ventricle is getting bigger, the blood from the right atrium cannot get into the right ventricle, so the right atrium starts enlarging. Two, if this valve is leaky for whatever reason, then blood that would ordinarily get pumped out gets pumped into the right atrium, causing it to stretch. And three, if, for example, you had a shunt, a hole in the heart, and the blood was coming into the right ventricle, then there's more blood here. That means more blood from the right atrium can't go into the right ventricle. The right atrium starts stretching. The other condition in which you may get a dilated right atrium is atrial fibrillation. In atrial fibrillation, the atria stop working, and because they stop working, they become flabby and they get bigger and bigger. Okay, so that's the right atrium. Then the next thing you will see on your echo report is some mention of the tricuspid valve, where they will comment on the structure of the tricuspid valve, and they will comment on whether the tricuspid valve is opening normally, or whether it's narrowed, or whether it's leaky. Okay, if it's narrowed, it is described as tricuspid stenosis. If it is leaky, it is described as tricuspid regurgitation. Tricuspid stenosis is very rare, it's very uncommon, but you can see it sometimes in people who've had rheumatic fever. Okay, rheumatic fever is an infection that affects the valves, and it causes the valves to become thickened and hard, and that can sometimes cause a narrowing. Now, if you had tricuspid stenosis, blood can't go from the right atrium into the valve, and that could also cause the right atrium to get big. So tricuspid stenosis, and the other condition is obviously tricuspid regurgitation. Now, if you see a trace of tricuspid regurgitation or mild tricuspid regurgitation, that is a completely normal finding. All right, everyone has a little bit of tricuspid regurgitation, and the reason is that when we are born we don't, but as we grow our chests flatten, our geometry of the valve changes, and everyone gets a little bit. So if you've got mild tricuspid regurgitation, please don't worry about it. It is a normal finding. If you have a trace of tricuspid regurgitation or trivial tricuspid regurgitation, do not worry. The only time you have to worry is if you have severe tricuspid regurgitation. And tricuspid regurgitation is usually a secondary thing. It's usually not because the valve itself is affected, but more so because either there's a problem getting the blood from the right ventricle into the lungs, i.e. if you have lung disease, blood can't get into the lungs, and therefore the pressure here rises, which therefore then stretches this chamber, and the tricuspid valve will stretch, and that will cause a leakage of the tricuspid valve. Sometimes it can also be if the valve itself gets infected, so with things like something called endocarditis, an infection of the valve can cause tricuspid regurgitation. But it's only severe tricuspid regurgitation that you need to worry about. What is the problem with tricuspid regurgitation? Exactly the same as any right heart condition, which is if you can't get the blood out, it leaks back. If it leaks back, the blood from the rest of the body can't get in, particularly blood from the legs and from the liver, etc., that it can't go back in. And that extra blood therefore leaks out into the legs and you develop leg swelling. Then you have this chamber here called the right ventricle. Now the right ventricle is really important because the right ventricle has two functions, all right? And the first is that it is pumping blood to the lungs. And secondly, whatever it pumps out is what eventually goes to the left heart. All right, so if the right ventricle is weak or doesn't pump blood out, then less blood goes to the lungs, and from the lungs less blood goes to the left heart, and therefore the left heart pumps out less blood to the vital organs. So it is very important for the right ventricle to work well, because that is what decides how much blood goes to the left heart, goes to the lungs and to the left heart. What kind of things affect the right ventricle? Again, mainly lung disease. If you have a problem with your lungs, then the right ventricle is going to struggle to pump blood out, and it will start stretching because the blood can't go anywhere. It sits there. Less blood goes to the lungs. From the lungs, less blood goes to the left heart. From the left heart, less blood goes to the kidneys. The kidneys think you're dehydrated. The kidneys start absorbing more. They restore the volume, and slowly, but if the lungs are bad, still the right heart can't get the blood out, and you get into this vicious cycle where the kidneys start absorbing more and more, and the amount of blood in your body increases, but the right ventricle still can't get the blood out because the lungs are bad, and the right ventricle starts stretching. As it stretches, it starts weakening. The other condition, as I say, is if you have a hole in the heart, the blood would go into the right ventricle, and that will cause it to stretch. And because it's going into the right ventricle, less blood is going to the rest of the body because it's coming across a hole into the right ventricle. So the kidneys get less blood. The kidneys absorb more to try and restore the circulating volume, but actually the more blood, the more will go through the hole to the right heart, and you get into this vicious cycle. So whenever you see a dilated right ventricle, you have to worry about, firstly, you have to worry about whether the lungs are bad, and secondly, you have to worry about whether there may be a hole in the heart from birth, okay, usually from birth. But it's a very uncommon thing. But if you have a dilated right heart, it is important to get that checked out by a cardiologist. Finally, you have this thing called the pulmonary valve here, all right? And this is, again, a trileaflet valve. If this is, in some people, this can be narrowed, particularly from birth, and those people are described as having pulmonary stenosis. And if this is narrowed, then obviously it would be more difficult to get the blood out. Usually, many people have very mild pulmonary stenosis, not significant. If you did have pulmonary stenosis, that one of the features you find is that the right heart becomes a lot more muscular because it's much more difficult getting the blood through. So this is a little bit about the right heart. So when you look at your echo report, look at the size of the right atrium. If the size of the right atrium is normal, then that's really reassuring. If the size of the right atrium is abnormal, is very large, then you have to ask yourself, is there a problem with the lungs? Is there a problem with the right ventricle? Is there a problem with the tricuspid valve? Then look at the tricuspid valve. Do not worry if you have mild or trivial tricuspid regurgitation. Everyone has that. Then look at the right ventricle. If the right ventricle is normal size, then that's very reassuring. If the right ventricle looks enlarged, looks much bigger, then you have to ask yourself two questions. One, is there a problem with the lungs? Number two, could I have had a hole in my heart from childhood, which was never picked up? And that is why my right ventricle has gradually started enlarging. And if that is the case, then it is important you see a cardiologist so that they can fix the hole to prevent the right ventricle from getting bigger and bigger, because the bigger it gets, the more it loses its elasticity. And if it loses its elasticity, then it gets weaker and you don't get that back. And then you have the pulmonary valve, and the pulmonary valve can sometimes be narrowed, but it's very, very rare. Remember, the symptoms of right ventricular disease, the right heart being weak, are largely going to be related to leg swelling, progressive leg swelling. And as the leg swelling gets worse, it gets higher up and up. And one way you can work out whether the leg swelling is due to water is that if you press on the leg, then it will leave an indentation where you press, and that tells you that there's water. And if that is the case, then it's well worth getting a scan. Firstly, just to make sure that the left heart is okay, because the left heart could do the same, because ultimately if the left heart is weak, it's not going to pump blood out, which means that the right heart is not going to be able to pump blood into it. But secondly, also just to make sure that the right heart itself is not damaged in any way or not weak. So I hope this was useful to you, and I hope that this will allow you to make sense of your echo report, and certainly not get too worried when you see little values, see things like mild tricuspid regurgitation, or that in itself, that is a normal finding. So thank you so much for watching my channel. Thank you so much for your kind words. Thank you so much for sharing. As I say, I love doing this. I get great appreciation from you, and I really, really appreciate everything you do for me. My website is www.yorkcardiology.co.uk. My Facebook page is York Cardiology 1. And my email address is yorkcardiology@gmail.com. So thank you so much, and all the best. Good night.